The monsoon never really ends in Burma. Even now, 40 years later, when I wake to English rain tapping my bedroom window, I'm back there in that green hell where the jungle breathed with us, around us, through us. Where something that wasn't quite human learned to mimic our voices in the dark. The official records say our column was wiped out by Japanese forces near Inda in March 1943. They're wrong. We weren't killed by the Japanese. We were taken by something far older, something that had been waiting in those ruins long before the first British boot touched Burmese soil. I'm the only one who walked out. And some nights I wonder if I should have stayed. The Chindits were Winston Churchill's madmen, Ord Wingate's long-range penetration groups, dropped deep behind enemy lines to wreak havoc on Japanese supply routes. We were meant to be ghosts, striking fast and melting back into the jungle. What we became was something else entirely. My name is Corporal Thomas Ashford, formerly of the 13th King's Liverpool Regiment, attached to the 77th Indian Infantry Brigade. Column 7, they called us. 63 men when we crossed the Chindwin River in February 1943. By the time we reached the ruins near Shwebo, we were 37. The jungle had claimed the rest. Disease, exhaustion, Japanese patrols, and the simple, grinding madness of living like animals in a green cathedral that wanted us dead. Major Thornfield commanded our column. A lean, weathered man who'd spent years on the northwest frontier, he spoke Hindustani like a native and could read the jungle like a London street map. Under him were Lieutenant Morrison, barely 22 but steady as iron, and Sergeant Hayes, a Yorkshireman who could fix anything with wire and profanity. The men were a mix of British and Gurkhas, each one handpicked for endurance and nerve. We'd been marching for 3 weeks when Private Jenkins found the stone. Our daily rhythm had settled into something almost comfortable. Wake before dawn to the sound of gibbons howling in the canopy. Cold tea and biscuits that tasted like sawdust. Check equipment, treat the endless parade of leeches and infected cuts, then march. Always march. The jungle pressed close on both sides, a living wall of bamboo and teak that muffled sound and swallowed light. Vines thick as a man's waist hung like nooses. Flowers bloomed in violent reds and purples, beautiful and somehow wrong, as if the jungle were dressing itself for a funeral. The heat was a living thing. By noon, our khaki uniforms hung sodden with sweat, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with malevolence. Every step squelched in mud that never dried, releasing bursts of methane that burned the nostrils. The smell was always the same: rot, flowers, and something else. Something sweet and cloying that reminded me of the morgue where my father had worked before the war. Water was our constant obsession. We purified everything we could find, but still, men fell, sick. Private Collins had been shitting blood for a week. Corporal Davies ran a fever that made him mutter in Welsh. The medical orderly, a slight man named Pemberton, did what he could with dwindling supplies, but we all knew the jungle was winning. At night, we'd hack out a rough perimeter and settle into our hammocks, listening to the symphony of things that hunted in the dark. Insects the size of mice, frogs that sounded like crying children, and always, somewhere in the distance, the soft pad of feet that might have been tigers, might have been Japanese scouts, might have been something else entirely. The men found ways to keep their spirits up. Hayes would spin elaborate lies about his exploits in Egypt, each tale more outrageous than the last. Morrison read poetry by flashlight, his voice barely a whisper, but somehow carrying through the humid air. The Gurkhas sang soft songs in Nepali that made the British lads homesick for places they'd never seen. But there were signs, even then, that something was wrong with this particular stretch of jungle. The birds went quiet at odd times, falling silent in the middle of the day for no reason we could fathom. Flowers that should have been closed at night hung open, their petals glistening with a phosphorescent sheen. And the trees, Christ, the trees seemed to lean inward when we weren't looking, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers. Jenkins was our point man, a wiry Londoner with the best eyes in the column. He could spot tripwires, track Japanese patrols, and find water where others saw only mud, which is why what happened next shook us so badly. We were crossing a stream, perhaps 20 feet wide and waist deep, when Jenkins suddenly stopped dead in the middle of the current. He stood there swaying, water rushing around his legs, staring at something on the far bank. His rifle slipped from nerveless fingers and disappeared beneath the brown water. "Jenkins!" Hayes barked. "Move your body!" But Jenkins didn't move. He was pointing at a moss-covered stone that jutted from the bank like a broken tooth. It was carved, we could see that much. Spirals and symbols that hurt the eyes to follow, worn smooth by centuries of rain, but still somehow sharp, somehow urgent. "There's something under it," Jenkins whispered, his voice carrying clearly across the water. Something breathing. Morrison waded out to retrieve him, but Jenkins fought like a madman, screaming that we couldn't disturb the stone, that it was keeping something sleeping. It took 4 of us to drag him to the far bank, and even then he kept looking back, his face pale as paper. That night he hanged himself with his own bootlaces. We found him at dawn, suspended from a branch not 10 feet from where we'd all been sleeping. His face was purple, tongue protruding, but his eyes were wide open and staring back toward the carved stone. In his left hand, clutched so tightly we had to break his fingers to retrieve it, was a piece of paper. Scrawled in his own handwriting were the words, "It's awake now. God help us all." Thornfield ordered the stone destroyed. Hayes rigged charges, small ones, just enough to crack it. But when the smoke cleared, the stone stood untouched. The explosives had torn up the earth around it, uprooted trees, sent wildlife fleeing for miles. But the stone itself didn't have so much as a scratch. That was when we heard the drums. They started at sunset, deep and rhythmic, echoing through the jungle from no direction we could pinpoint. Not Japanese drums, we knew that sound. These were older, made from wood and hide that had been curing for generations. The beat was hypnotic, almost ceremonial, rising and falling like a heartbeat. Morrison tried to triangulate the source with his compass, but the needle spun wildly, pointing first north, then east, then spinning in lazy circles as if the very concept of direction had broken down. Hayes cursed and smacked his radio, but all we got was static punctuated by what sounded like voices speaking in languages that predated speech. The Gurkhas knew. I could see it in their faces, the way they fingered their kukris and muttered prayers to gods with unpronounceable names. Sergeant Pemba, their leader, approached Thornfield with the careful deference of a man delivering very bad news. "Sahib," he said quietly, "this place is Paka haunted. We should leave. Now." But we couldn't leave. Our orders were clear. Proceed to the railway line near Inda, sabotage what we could, then make for the extraction point 200 miles south. Wingate's grand strategy depended on columns like ours, creating chaos behind enemy lines. We were already behind schedule. Thornfield made the decision that doomed us all. We would proceed as planned, but we'd avoid the immediate area around the stone. Stay on the high ground, move fast, don't look back. None of us slept that night. The drums continued until dawn, joined sometime around midnight by what sounded like chanting. Men reported seeing lights moving between the trees, pale and cold like foxfire. But when we investigated with flashlights, there was nothing there. Private Morrison, not the lieutenant, but a different Morrison, a quiet lad from Glasgow, started talking in his sleep. Not English. Something else. Something that made the Gurkhas cross themselves and the British lads reach for their rifles. He spoke for hours in fluent, flowing sentences in a language that sounded like wind through bones. When we woke him, he had no memory of it. But carved into the tree above his hammock, cut deep enough to weep sap, were the same spirals we'd seen on the stone. The jungle began to change around us. Subtly at first, then with gathering momentum. Paths appeared where none had been before, worn smooth by the passage of feet, but leading in directions that made no sense. Trees grew in perfect circles, their trunks twisted into spirals that echoed the carvings. Flowers bloomed out of season, their petals the color of old blood, and always the feeling that we were being watched. It was Hayes who first saw them clearly. We were making camp in a small clearing, perhaps 50 yards across, ringed by bamboo thick as a man's thigh. The light was fading, that peculiar green twilight of the jungle, when Hayes suddenly went rigid. "Movement," he whispered, pointing toward the tree line. "There, by the big teak." We all looked. At first, I saw nothing. Then the shadows shifted, and I made out a human figure standing motionless among the trees. It was too far to make out features, but something about its posture was wrong. It stood too straight, too still, like a man carved from wood. "Japanese?" Morrison whispered. Thornfield raised his binoculars. For a long moment he stared through the lenses, then he lowered them, his face pale. "It's wearing our uniform," he said quietly. "British battle dress." More figures appeared, dozens of them standing at the edge of the clearing like an honor guard. All in British uniform, all perfectly still. All watching us with eyes we couldn't see, but could feel like weights pressing against our skulls. Then Private Collins screamed. He was pointing at one of the figures, a tall man in a corporal's stripes who stood slightly apart from the others. "That's my brother," Collins cried. "That's Jimmy. He died at Dunkirk. I saw his body." Before anyone could stop him, Collins was running across the clearing, arms outstretched, calling his brother's name. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge him, just stood there like a statue as Collins ran closer and closer. Collins reached the tree line and grabbed the figure by the shoulders. For a moment, they stood locked together like dancers. Then Collins began to scream again, but this time it was different. This time it was terror, pure and absolute. The figure that looked like his brother opened its mouth and beetles poured out. Hundreds of them, black and clicking, cascading down Collins' chest as he tried to tear himself away. The other figures began to move then, closing in with that same unnatural stillness, and we could see their faces in the dying light. They were our faces. Every man in the column, living and dead, stared back at us from the tree line, but their eyes were wrong, too dark, too deep, like holes punched through paper into something vast and hungry. We opened fire. Muzzle flashes lit the clearing like strobe lights. Bullets tore through the figures, but they didn't fall. They didn't even flinch. They just kept advancing, their mouths hanging open, beetles and centipedes and things with too many legs spilling out in black waterfalls. "Fall back," Thornfield shouted. "Fighting withdrawal." We retreated through the jungle, crashing through undergrowth that seemed to grab at our equipment, firing at shapes that followed us with relentless patience. Behind us, Collins was still screaming, but the sound was getting fainter, more distant, until it faded entirely into the symphony of the night. We ran until we couldn't run anymore, then kept running anyway. When dawn finally broke, we found ourselves in another clearing. This one dominated by ruins that definitely weren't on any map. The structure rose from the jungle floor like a fever dream made stone. It was old, older than the British Empire, older than the Japanese occupation, older than recorded history. The architecture was unlike anything I'd seen in Burma or anywhere else. Massive blocks of black stone fitted together without mortar, covered in the same spiral carvings that had driven Jenkins to suicide. But it was what lay at the base of the structure that made my blood turn to ice water. Bones, human bones, picked clean and arranged in careful patterns. Skulls stacked in pyramids. Rib cages woven together like baskets. Femurs laid out in spirals that echoed the stone carvings. And in the center of it all, a pit. The pit was perhaps 10 feet across, lined with more of the black stone. Steps led down into darkness, so complete it seemed solid. The air rising from it carried scents that had no business existing. Ozone and copper and something sweetly rotten that made the back of my throat close up. "Jesus Christ," Morrison breathed. "What is this place?" Sergeant Pemba was backing away, his usually impassive face twisted with fear. "Rakshasa," he whispered. "Demon place. We go now, Sahib. We go very fast." But Thornfield was studying the ruins with the fascination of a scholar. He pulled out his notebook and began sketching the carvings, his hand moving in quick, precise strokes. "Extraordinary," he murmured. "The craftsmanship is incredible. These symbols, they're not Burmese, not Indian, they're something else entirely." Private Davies found the first body while Thornfield was sketching. It was wedged between two fallen stones, mummified by the jungle heat. The uniform was British, but the cut was wrong. Too old, the fabric faded to an unidentifiable brown. Around the corpse's neck hung a set of dog tags, so corroded they were barely legible. Davies managed to make out a name and a date. "Williamson, J.," he read aloud, 1887. "That's impossible," Morrison said. "The British didn't penetrate this far into Burma until the 1920s. More bodies emerged as we searched the ruins. Dozens of them, all in various stages of decomposition. British uniforms from different eras. Victorian red coats, Great War khaki, modern battle dress like our own. All bearing signs of violent death. All arranged around the pit in concentric circles like offerings to whatever lived in the darkness below. In the center of the bone garden, partially hidden beneath a skull that grinned with too many teeth, Hayes found a leather-bound journal. The cover was water-stained and cracked, but still readable. Embossed in fading gold letters, property of Major H. Thornfield, 5th Gurkha Rifles. Our Major Thornfield went white as paper. With shaking hands, he opened the journal to the first page. In his own handwriting, dated 50 years in the future, were the words, "If you are reading this, you are already dead. The pit has you now. God forgive us all." The journal detailed our expedition with uncanny accuracy. Every man's name, every decision, every death. It described Colin's encounter with the figures in perfect detail, down to the beetles pouring from his brother's mouth. It described our discovery of the ruins, our decision to explore the pit, and what we found waiting in the darkness below. According to the journal, we would make camp at the ruins that night. We would post guards and try to rest, but rest would not come. The drums would start again, louder this time, echoing up from the pit itself. Men would begin sleepwalking, drawn by voices that called their names in the darkness. One by one, they would disappear into the pit, and in the morning we would find only their uniforms, neatly folded at the edge of the stone circle. The journal described how Thornfield himself would finally descend into the pit, following the sound of his wife's voice calling from the depths. How he would find a vast chamber filled with the bones of centuries, where something ancient and hungry waited to add him to its collection. "This is madness," Morrison whispered. "You can't have written this. The dates are all wrong. But Thornfield was staring at the journal with growing horror. "The handwriting," he said. "It's mine. Every loop, every flourish. This is my hand." As if summoned by his words, the drums began. They rose from the pit like smoke, deep and rhythmic, setting up resonances in our bones. The sound was impossible. Drums don't echo that way, don't penetrate flesh and marrow, don't make grown men weep with homesickness for places that never existed. Hayes tried to organize a defense. He positioned men around the perimeter, established fields of fire, checked ammunition. But even as he worked, I could see the futility in his eyes. You can't establish a perimeter against something that comes from inside your own head. You can't maintain fields of fire when the enemy is memory itself. The first man to disappear was Davies. I was watching him one moment. He was checking his rifle, normal as anything, and the next moment his position was empty. Just gone, as if he'd never been there at all. His rifle lay in the dirt, still warm from his hands. "Davies," Hayes called. "Davies, sound off." No answer. But from the direction of the pit came a sound like laughter, high and sweet and utterly inhuman. Morrison lasted until midnight. I saw him stand up from his position, his movements stiff and jerky like a marionette. He walked toward the pit with careful, measured steps, his eyes fixed on something none of the rest of us could see. When Hayes tried to stop him, Morrison simply pushed past him with inhuman strength, never breaking stride. At the edge of the pit, Morrison paused. For a moment, I thought he might break free of whatever hold the place had on him. Then he smiled, a wide, beatific smile that didn't belong on his young face, and stepped forward into the darkness. His scream echoed up from the depths for what felt like hours. By dawn, we were down to 8 men: Thornfield, Hayes, myself, Sergeant Pemba, and 4 other Gurkhas whose names I never learned. The journal lay open beside Thornfield's sleeping bag, its pages fluttering in a wind that touched nothing else. Thornfield read aloud from the final entry, his voice flat and emotionless. "The pit is not a grave. It is a mouth, and it is always hungry. The only way to stop it is to feed it something it cannot digest, something already dead, something that chooses to die." He closed the journal and stood up, his movements calm and deliberate. "I'm going down there," he said. "Someone has to. The journal says so." "The journal's mad," Hayes protested. "You can't trust it." But even as he spoke, I could see the futility of argument. The pit had claimed every British expedition that had ever found this place. It would claim us too, unless someone made the choice that the journal described. Thornfield checked his pistol, straightened his uniform, and walked to the edge of the pit. The steps leading down were slick with moisture that might have been dew, might have been something else. He paused at the first step and looked back at us. "Tell them we died well," he said. "Tell them we died as soldiers." Then he descended into the darkness, and the drum stopped. For a heartbeat, the jungle was utterly silent. No insects, no birds, no wind in the trees. Even our own breathing seemed muffled, as if the very air had thickened around us. Then the screaming started. It came from the pit, but it was more than Thornfield's voice. It was every man who had ever descended those steps, every soldier who had been consumed by whatever waited in the darkness. Centuries of agony given voice, rising up from the depths like steam from hell's own kettle. The sound built and built until I thought my eardrums would burst. Then, abruptly, it cut off. From the pit rose something that might have been laughter. "Run," Sergeant Pemba whispered. "Run now." We ran. Through the jungle, through the ruins, through the garden of bones, we ran like men pursued by all the demons of hell. Behind us, something was climbing out of the pit. I didn't look back. couldn't look back, but I heard it. The scrape of claws on stone, the wet slither of something too large to exist, the sound of breathing that echoed from too many throats. Haze fell first, brought down by vines that moved like living things. His screams followed us for miles. The Gurkhas disappeared one by one, picked off by shadows that moved faster than thought. By the time I reached the river, I was alone. I crossed at dawn, half drowned and delirious with fever. On the far bank, a British patrol found me 3 days later, more dead than alive. They took me to a field hospital, where I spent 2 months learning how to be human again. The official report lists Column 7 as missing in action, presumed killed by enemy forces. No mention of ruins or pits or things that wear the faces of the dead. No mention of journals that predict the future or drums that echo from the darkness below the world. I tried to tell them. God knows I tried. But who would believe such a story? Who would accept that there are places in this world where the laws of nature simply don't apply? Where ancient hungers wait in the darkness for foolish men to stumble into their grasp? So I kept quiet. I finished my service, came home to England, found work in a factory that made electrical components. I married a good woman, raised 2 children, lived the life of an ordinary man touched by extraordinary horror. But the dreams never stopped. Every night I'm back in that clearing, watching Morrison walk toward the pit with that terrible smile on his face. Every night I hear Thornfield's voice calling from the darkness, begging me to come down and join him in whatever hell he's found. And sometimes, when the rain is heavy and the night is dark, I hear the drums again, faint but growing stronger, echoing up from storm drains and subway tunnels, from basements and root cellars, from every dark place where the old hungers might still be waiting. The journal disappeared from my kit bag sometime during my hospital stay. I like to think it was destroyed, burned or buried or lost, but I know better. Somewhere, in some dusty archive or forgotten attic, it waits for the next expedition, the next group of soldiers who think they can conquer the darkness with rifles and determination. I carry the notebook McKenna pressed into my hands that last night in France. The symbols are still there, still sharp, still somehow urgent. Sometimes I trace them with my finger and remember the weight of his blood on the stone, the way the fog recoiled from his sacrifice. Subscribe before you go looking for places that shouldn't exist. Hit that notification bell before you venture into jungles where the trees remember older wars. And in the comments, tell me, what's the closest you've ever come to something that definitely shouldn't have been there? Let's map the thin places, the spots where our world touches something else. Because I've learned, in 40 years of ordinary life, that the monsters aren't hiding in the dark places of the world. They're hiding in the dark places of ourselves, and they're always hungry. What I haven't told you yet is what happened in those final moments before I reached the river. What I saw when I looked back just once at the thing that had climbed out of the pit. Some memories are too sharp to dull with time, too clear to dismiss as fever dreams. I was perhaps half a mile from the ruins when exhaustion finally caught me. My legs gave out beneath a stand of bamboo so thick it blocked the sky. The air was thick with the smell of rotting vegetation and something else, that same sweet, cloying odor that had followed us since Jenkins found the stone. I pressed my back against a tree trunk and tried to catch my breath, listening for sounds of pursuit. The jungle had gone quiet again. Not the natural quiet of dawn breaking, but that unnatural silence that had preceded every horror we'd encountered. No insects, no birds, no rustle of leaves in the canopy above. Even the ever-present drip of moisture from the trees had stopped. That's when I heard Hayes. Ashford. His voice called from somewhere behind me. "Thomas, where are you?" I nearly answered. Christ, I nearly called out to him. The relief of hearing a familiar voice, of thinking someone else had survived, was almost overwhelming. But something in his tone stopped me. Hayes had never called me by my first name, not once in all the months we'd served together. To him, I was always Corporal, or Ashford if he was being informal. "Thomas," the voice called again, closer now, "don't leave me here. Don't leave me alone." I could hear him moving through the undergrowth, his boots squelching in the mud. But the footsteps were wrong. Too heavy, too deliberate, as if whatever was wearing Hayes's voice was concentrating very hard on remembering how a human being was supposed to walk. Through a gap in the bamboo, I caught sight of him. At first glance, it looked like Hayes. Same khaki uniform, same sergeant's stripes, same weathered face beneath his steel helmet. But he was walking upright, too upright, with his arms hanging straight at his sides like a child's wooden doll. And his eyes were holes. Not empty sockets, but actual holes punched clean through his skull, showing the jungle behind him. "I can smell you, Thomas," Hayes, that wasn't Hayes, said, his voice still perfectly mimicking my sergeant's Yorkshire accent. "I can smell your fear. It's sweet, like flowers." I pressed myself deeper into the bamboo and tried not to breathe. The thing that wore Hayes's shape walked past my hiding spot, its head turning from side to side with mechanical precision. Where its eyes should have been, those terrible holes showed glimpses of writhing darkness, as if the inside of its skull was packed with living shadow. It paused directly in front of me, so close I could have reached out and touched its sleeve. For a moment, those empty sockets seemed to look right at me. Then its mouth opened far too wide, the jaw unhinging like a snake's, and beetles began to pour out. The same black, clicking beetles that had spilled from Collins's brother in the clearing. The thing that looked like Hayes smiled with a mouth full of insects and moved on. I waited until I couldn't hear its footsteps anymore, then waited longer still. When I finally moved, my legs had gone numb from crouching. I crawled through the bamboo on hands and knees, moving as quietly as I could manage until I reached the edge of the stand. The ruins were visible from there, perhaps a quarter-mile away through the trees. What I saw made my blood freeze in my veins. The pit was glowing. Not with fire or electric light, but with something else. Something that hurt to look at directly. Pale, phosphorescent radiance poured up from the opening like liquid moonlight, casting everything around it in sickly green shadows. And in that light, shapes moved. They emerged from the pit in a steady procession, climbing the stone steps with careful, measured movements. Dozens of them, then hundreds. British soldiers from every era, their uniforms marking them as Peninsular War veterans, Crimean survivors, Boer War casualties, Great War dead. All walking with that same unnatural stillness, all bearing the wounds that had killed them decades or centuries before. But it wasn't just soldiers. As I watched in horror, I saw women in Victorian dress, their pale faces serene in death. Children in sailor suits and pinafores, their small hands clasped in front of them. Even animals, dogs, horses, what looked like an elephant with mahogany dark skin stretched tight over jutting ribs. All of them had the same empty eye sockets. All of them moved with that terrible mechanical precision, and all of them were spreading out into the jungle, fanning out in every direction like the spokes of a vast wheel. I understood then what the pit truly was. Not just a grave or a feeding ground, but a recruitment center. Every life it consumed became another soldier in its army of the dead. Every expedition that found the ruins added to its strength. For centuries, it had been building this force, preparing for something. The thing that had once been Major Thornfield emerged last. I recognized his lean frame, his officer's bearing, even the way he adjusted his cap with one gloved hand. But when he turned toward my hiding place, I saw that his face was gone. Not destroyed or rotted away, but simply absent, as if it had been carefully carved out with a surgeon's knife. In the hollow where his features should have been, that same writhing darkness moved like smoke. He raised one hand, and the entire procession stopped. Then he pointed directly at me. "There," he said in Thornfield's clipped public school accent. "The last one. Bring him." I ran. Through the jungle, over fallen logs slick with moss, under vines that tried to snare my ankles, I ran like a man possessed. Behind me, I could hear them coming. Not running, they never ran, but walking with that same relentless pace, crashing through the undergrowth with the sound of an avalanche. My lungs burned, my vision blurred. Thorns tore at my uniform, and leeches fastened themselves to my skin, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't slow down. The river was ahead somewhere, and if I could reach it, if I could cross it, maybe the water would stop them. Maybe running water was still holy in this green hell where nothing else made sense. I burst out of the tree line and nearly ran straight into a Japanese patrol. There were 6 of them, crossing a small clearing in single file, their rifles held at the ready. They turned at the sound of my approach, their faces registering surprise, then alarm. One of them shouted something in Japanese and raised his weapon. I should have been terrified. These were the enemy, the men we'd been sent to fight. But after what I'd seen in the ruins, after what was pursuing me through the jungle, they looked wonderfully, beautifully human. Their eyes held light. Their movements were awkward and natural. They smelled of sweat and fear and tobacco instead of that sickly sweet rot. "English," I shouted, raising my hands. "English soldier." The Japanese soldiers hesitated. One of them, an officer by his bearing, stepped forward and barked a question I didn't understand. I pointed back toward the jungle, toward the sounds of pursuit that were growing louder. "Run," I said in English, then tried to remember the few words of Japanese I'd picked up from prisoners. "Nigeru! Run! Oni! Demons!" The officer's eyes widened. Whether he understood my words or simply heard the terror in my voice, he began shouting orders to his men. They formed a rough line, rifles aimed at the tree line, just as the first of the dead emerged from the jungle. It was Private Davies, or what had once been Davies. His throat had been torn out. I could see straight through to his spine. But he walked steadily forward, his empty sockets fixed on the Japanese soldiers. Behind him came Morrison, half his head caved in from his fall into the pit. Then Collins, beetles still pouring from the gaping wound in his chest. The Japanese opened fire. Muzzle flashes strobed in the green twilight, and bullets tore through the advancing figures. But the dead didn't fall. They didn't even slow down. Holes appeared in their uniforms. Chunks of rotted flesh flew away, but they kept walking with that terrible mechanical precision. One of the Japanese soldiers screamed and broke ranks, running toward the far side of the clearing. Davies turned and walked after him with patient, unhurried steps. The soldier made it perhaps 20 yards before Davies caught him. What happened next? I try not to think about what happened next. The officer was still firing, his pistol barking again and again as Morrison approached. When the gun clicked empty, he drew his sword and stood his ground. Morrison's remaining hand reached out and gently took the blade by the edge, his rotted fingers closing around the steel. Blood, if it was blood, ran down the sword and dripped onto the jungle floor. "Gomen nasai," Morrison said in perfect Japanese, his voice soft and polite. "I'm sorry." Then he pulled the officer forward onto the blade until they were face to face. The officer screamed once before Morrison opened his ruined mouth and breathed something dark and writhing into his lungs. I didn't wait to see the rest. While the dead were occupied with the Japanese patrol, I slipped around the edge of the clearing and kept running. Behind me, the gunfire stopped. The screaming continued for a while longer, then faded into the symphony of the jungle night. The river found me more than I found it. I stumbled down a muddy bank and splashed into water that came up to my chest. The current was strong, fed by the monsoon rains, and it nearly swept me away before I managed to grab hold of a fallen branch and haul myself toward the far shore. Halfway across, I looked back. They were there, standing on the bank I'd just left. All of them, Davies, Morrison, Collins, the Japanese soldiers who had just died. Even the officer with Morrison's darkness still leaking from his mouth. They stood in a perfect line, watching me struggle against the current, but they didn't enter the water. The thing that had been Major Thornfield stepped to the front of the group. Even from a distance, I could see the hollow where his face should have been, the writhing darkness that filled it like smoke. He raised one hand in what might have been a salute or a farewell. "Until next time, Corporal Ashford," he called across the water, his voice carrying clearly despite the distance. "We'll be waiting." Then they turned and walked back into the jungle, and I was alone. I reached the far bank as dawn was breaking, more dead than alive. My uniform hung in tatters, my body was covered in cuts and insect bites, and I was running a fever that made the world shimmer like a mirage. But I was across. I had crossed running water, and they hadn't followed. The patrol that found me 3 days later said I'd been talking to myself when they spotted me, carrying on a conversation with someone who wasn't there. They said I kept apologizing to empty air, begging forgiveness for something I wouldn't explain. The fever broke in the field hospital, but the dreams remained. Every night I'm back on that riverbank, watching the dead stand in perfect formation. Every night I hear Thornfield's promise echoing across the water. And every morning I wake to find mud under my fingernails that wasn't there when I went to sleep. The war ended eventually. Burma fell to the Japanese, then fell to the Allies when the tide turned. Wingate died in a plane crash in 1944, taking his dreams of long-range penetration with him. The Chindits were disbanded, their records filed away in dusty cabinets, their sacrifices reduced to footnotes in history books. But I know the truth. Somewhere in that green hell, the pit still glows with its terrible light. The dead still emerge in their endless procession, adding to their ranks with every soul they claim. And one day, when their army is large enough, when they've gathered sufficient strength, they'll cross that river. They'll cross it, and then they'll keep walking. Through the jungles of Burma, across the mountains of India, over the oceans and continents, spreading their particular brand of hungry darkness wherever they go. An army of the dead led by British officers who remember their duty even in death. I see the signs sometimes in newspaper articles about missing hikers in remote forests, about archaeological expeditions that simply vanish without trace, about places where the locals whisper warnings about spirits in the trees and demons in the earth. The pit's influence is spreading, reaching out through the network of dark places that exists just beneath the surface of our rational world. And sometimes, late at night, when the rain sounds like marching feet on my bedroom window, I wonder if I really escaped at all. Maybe I'm still there in that jungle, my bones picked clean and arranged in careful spirals around the pit. Maybe this whole life, the factory job, the wife, the children, the quiet suburban existence, is just the dream of a dead man who can't accept what he's become. Maybe I'm already part of their army, and I just haven't realized it yet. the thought should terrify me. Instead, it brings a strange kind of peace. Because if that's true, if I never really left that place, then at least I'm not alone. At least I'm with my lads again, standing in formation on the banks of that dark river, waiting for orders that will never come. But until I know for certain, I'll keep telling this story. I'll keep warning anyone who'll listen about the places where the old hungers wait, about jungles that remember wars older than civilization, about pits that glow with phosphorescent malice, about stones carved with spirals that hurt to look upon. Because somewhere out there, another expedition is being planned. Another group of soldiers or explorers or archaeologists is preparing to venture into places that should be left alone. And when they find what's waiting for them in the darkness, when they hear the drums echoing up from depths that should not exist, maybe they'll remember this story. Maybe they'll be wise enough to turn back. Or maybe they'll join the ranks of the dead, adding their voices to the chorus that sings in languages older than speech, their bones to the patterns that spiral ever outward from that hungry pit in the heart of the green hell. Either way, the army grows, and the river won't stop them forever.